Well, hello and a very warm welcome to this virtual tour of the New Testament in the British Museum hosted by St Helen's Church. My name is Campbell, Patterson, and I work for the 4 p.m. congregation at St Helen's. Now, the purpose of this tour is to try and paint a picture of the historical setting for the New Testament section of the Bible. And we're going to be using the archaeology that we find in the British Museum as our window into exploring that history. The books of the New Testament were written in the latter half of the 1st century AD, roughly speaking, and between them they comprise 5 books of historical narrative, a collection of different letters, and 1 book of apocalyptic literature. And of course, they all contain a particular set of events that happened to a man named Jesus of Nazareth. Those events are his life, his death, his alleged resurrection from the dead, and the aftermath of those events. They are fundamentally historical books, that is, they claim to be written in response to real events that actually happened. They're not just religious philosophy. So we've put together this tour of the British Museum that helps us to explore the historical backdrop into which the New Testament books fit. If you read the Bible regularly, I hope this will add colour to your reading, and it will perhaps fill in a few assumptions that the New Testament authors make. Those for whom it was written didn't need the setting explained to them because they were living in it, but we might do in the 21st century so that we don't make wrong assumptions as we read the Bible. If you don't read the Bible regularly but were intrigued enough to come along to this tour anyway, I hope you'll find the history stimulating, and perhaps it will even inspire you to read some of the New Testament for yourself. So here we are in the British Museum, which has been photographed on a nice quiet evening where there are no tourists around. You can actually tour through the whole museum on Google Maps virtually, as I'm doing here, although the interface is a little clunky at points, as we will discover. Oh, yeah, struggling to get through this door. There we go. So here we are coming into the Enlightenment Gallery, but where we really want to go is upstairs into the Persian wing. And rather than taking the stairs because we're a bit lazy, we're going to cheat and take the lift. There we go. So now we're upstairs where we want to be, and this is where our tour begins. So we begin here roughly half a century before Jesus was born in ancient Babylon under the control of the Persian Empire. So here's a Persian king, a plaster cast of a Persian king, possibly King Xerxes, as mentioned in the Old Testament part of the Bible. But what I actually want to show you is in the room adjacent. It's a small clay cylinder here that comes from the time of King Cyrus the Great, king of Persia. So this is a small clay cylinder, and the resolution is not particularly great, so I'm actually going to call up a still shot so that you can see it a little bit more easily. There we go. Now you'll notice that this cylinder has writing all over it. This was one way that ancient cultures made written documents, by scribing them on clay and baking them. And it's telling us several things. Partly it's a rather tedious and self-congratulatory piece of writing, boasting about King Cyrus's military victories, having just defeated the Babylonian Empire. Which apparently entitles him to call himself King of the Universe, perhaps a tad overplaying his achievements. But it is also in part a legal document outlining King Cyrus's foreign policy, in particular his willingness to send back peoples that he has captured, or that the Babylonian Empire that he overtook has captured and deported. Now, one such nation that had been deported by the Babylons was the Jewish people. They were one of the nations that had been deported into exile when the Babylonians had come and invaded their land. And they were one of the nations who had been sent back to their land under the decree of Cyrus the Great, king of Persia. The Old Testament part of the Bible is all about the history of Israel, and so King Cyrus is a significant character in the Old Testament because of this event. For the Jews, this marked a great time of hope for them, because being in exile under the Babylons was rubbish, but now was a chance to go back home again. But there was much more to it than that. They also believed that this was all part of some big divine plan. Let me explain a little bit more with the help of a diagram here. Now, you see, the Jews living around the time of King Cyrus the Great believed that they were living in the middle of a very long story. It was a story that had started well for them, but seemed to have kind of gone in the wrong direction. It had its beginnings with Moses back in Egypt several centuries earlier. Their ancestors had been enslaved there by a very harsh pharaoh. But they believed that the one God of the whole world had radically changed their fortunes, so the story went. He had rescued them from their slavery. He had single-handedly triumphed over Pharaoh by sending him 10 unstoppable plagues, and he had forced Pharaoh to let them go free. And God had defeated their army when they subsequently gave chase. He drowned them in the Red Sea after giving the Hebrews safe passage, and he brought them safely across the desert to give them their own land in modern-day Israel. And the reason that God had rescued them was because he had a plan for them. It wasn't just a random act of mercy. God had a whole purpose set out for them, so they believed, a divine plan. He had revealed to Moses that he had a plan to liberate the whole earth from all the forces of evil and corruption, just as he had rescued them from Egypt. And they were to be his means of carrying out that plan. They were to be like a beacon of light in a world full of darkness. They were to be a witness that the God of heaven and earth had a plan to set the whole world free. But the story had not been a straightforward one. Their high point was under the rule of King David and then King Solomon. But after that, the story seemed to go in the wrong direction. Eventually, several centuries later, they were invaded by first the Assyrian Empire and then by the Babylonian Empire, and their nation was left completely in ruins. Almost all of the people were deported to Babylon and sent into exile. Now, the Jewish prophets interpreted this as all God's doing. They said that this was not a failure on God's part or that he had changed his mind, as if, it had all started well when he rescued them from Egypt, but he sort of got bored in the meantime and just left them to their own devices. Rather, this was a divine act of justice, because over centuries they had abandoned him and turned to worship other gods. And he had warned them from the beginning that he'd take radical action if they forsook him, but they hadn't listened. So said the prophets. But neither was it the end of the story. The prophets also promised that he would stick with his original plan. He had committed himself to Israel in the beginning, and he would remain faithful to that commitment. Their exile, their deportation to Babylon, would be an act of discipline, but he would forgive them, and he would give them a fresh new start at some point in the future. And he had put his plan for the whole world back on track. Which brings us back to the Cyrus cylinder. The prophet Isaiah had said that the fresh new start would begin when the Babylonian Empire gave way to the Persian Empire, and King Cyrus of Persia would send them back home to Israel to rebuild again. A fresh start, a new hope, like Star Wars Episode 4 for all you nerds out there. Now, many skeptical scholars reading Isaiah for centuries wondered if he'd just sort of made all of this up. I mean, after all, who ever heard of an ancient king who would do such a thing, to send exiled nations home after they had been conquered? The whole point of conquering other nations was to enslave them, like Pharaoh had done. Then they'll do all your dirty work for you. There's no point in sending them home. So was this just a case of the Bible being a little bit fanciful? Well, in 1879, this clay cylinder was excavated in the ruins of ancient Babylon, and although it doesn't mention the Jews specifically, it tells us that King Cyrus's policy was indeed to send captured nations back home again. It was actually a very sophisticated strategy in managing an empire, and it fits exactly with what the prophet Isaiah said would happen. So the Jews returned to their land expecting a fresh start. But there was one vital niggle, one detail which was the spanner in the works, which is that they remained under the jurisdiction of the Persian Empire, as this clay cylinder describes. Cyrus sent exiled nations home again, but that didn't mean he just sort of left them to their own devices. He was still in charge. They still reported back to him. In every other way, they were still essentially in exile, other than the fact that they had been allowed to return back home again. And therefore, as you can imagine, tension began to build. The illustration I'd like you to imagine is one of two tectonic plates rubbing together. Israel was able to get on with things under the current arrangement, but tension was building under the surface, and it was fueled by a deep conviction that they had God on their side. Getting back to their land was a start, but they were waiting for God to truly liberate them. And so begins the essential historical backdrop for the New Testament. Two tectonic plates rubbing together. One, the dominant superpower in charge at the time, the Persians to begin with. The other, the Jewish people, fueled by a conviction that God was going to save them once and for all, not just bring them back to their land again. And the rumblings would continue all the way into the 1st century AD, by which time the dominant superpower was then the Roman Empire. And finally, the metaphorical volcano erupted in 70 AD, 30 years or so after the death of Jesus. The Roman plate finally came crashing into the Jewish plate after many provocations. The Emperor Nero sent for a bloodthirsty destruction of the Jewish capital, Jerusalem, which Cyrus had half a century earlier sent them all back to. Their most important building, the temple, was razed to the ground. It was also their symbol of the God in whom they trusted, and so that hope was given a devastating blow. The Jews were finally put in their place, their tectonic plate left to float away limply, and all their dreams and expectations seemed to have come to nothing. This was the historical backdrop into which the first century, in the 1st century when the New Testament was written. The New Testament means what it means within that historical context. It wasn't as if Jesus turned up in 30 AD and sort of invented a new religion called Christianity, like he was some sort of hippie and he could have rocked up in the Bahamas and had done the same thing. The New Testament fits within the Jewish story as it comes into conflict with the empires of its day, leading up to the war in AD 70 with the Roman army. But the next thing I'd like to show you is a piece of graffiti which was scratched on a plaster wall in Rome, possibly sometime around 200 AD. So we're jumping right to the other end of the time scale for this tour now, from the Cyrus cylinder where we started. And I'm also cheating because this isn't actually housed in the British Museum at all. It comes from the Palatine Museum in Rome. But it is helpful for our tour because it helps us to understand the impact of the New Testament within that world of conflict between the Roman Empire and the Jewish people. So how does it do that? Well, this drawing depicts a crucified man with a donkey head and another man standing to the left raising his hand in homage. The inscription that goes with it mockingly says, "Alexamenos worships God." Now, the artist, whoever they were, clearly thought this was very funny. He's ridiculing a man he knows called Alexamenos, who worships as a god a man who was crucified. And to try and show how ludicrous this is, he's drawn a donkey head on the man. Classic humour. What a lad. For him, it's the most laughable idea that his mate Alexamenos venerates a man who was crucified. And not only that, but he seems to think he's some kind of god and worthy of worship. It's a ridiculous idea. It's also possibly the earliest known depiction of the crucifixion of Jesus, and it's not a flattering one. And the reason for the artist's scorn is obvious. Crucifixion was the Roman way of showing that any particular person was a total loser. They had perfected the art of crucifixion to turn it into a complete public spectacle. It was designed to totally humiliate in the most extreme possible way. Crucifixion made it quite clear who was in charge. Whenever an uprising in the Roman Empire was quelled, the leader would be paraded through the streets and crucified outside the city gates for everybody to see. It was a cheerful Roman way of making sure that any of the followers of that leader who are still alive knew quite clearly that their efforts had come to nothing. The symbol of the cross has changed, of course, but in the Roman world it was a clear symbol that Rome and her gods win. Rome always wins. And therefore, to worship someone who had been made a public spectacle was an absurd idea. He's been crucified. You've lost. It's game over. Find yourself another leader. It would be like, I don't know, just to take an entirely random example that just occurred to me. Imagine if the President of the United States had been voted out of office and some of his followers were still insisting that he was the rightful president, even though the votes had all been counted and recounted. He's lost. Move on. Just find yourself another leader. To pick an entirely random example. And so our artist thinks it's high time that Alexamenos was ridiculed with the scorn that he deserved. Alexamenos worships God, a donkey man who was crucified. What an idiot! In fact, it's almost sad, isn't it, that someone could be so deluded? And so the question is, how did this happen? It's a very interesting historical question. The Jews were all put in their place roughly a century before this was drawn and their temple destroyed in AD 70. They had lost the war. They were proved to be losers. So how was it that a Jewish man who was crucified slightly earlier than that in first century Judea was being worshipped by a Roman man, the very people who destroyed the Jewish capital, a century or so after that in Italy? Albeit to the great amusement of his friends. But how did it even get to that? How did the rubbing together of the Greco-Roman plate and the Jewish plate, that seemed to have been settled in AD 70, with the Romans as the winners and the Jews as the losers, how did it produce this? And little did our artist know that a century or so after him, the emperor himself would claim to worship the donkey man as well. So what on earth happened? How did the Jews manage to pull that one off? Well, that's what we're going to be exploring as we go on through the rest of this tour. But let's go all the way back to Persia again. You will remember that from the little clay cylinder that we looked at, that by decree of Cyrus of Persia, the king of, what was it that he said? King of the universe. That's what he called himself. The Jews returned to Israel full of hope and anticipation. Their fathers had made a terrible mistake, and the story seemed to have gone in the wrong direction. But now it looked like God's promises to give them a fresh start were coming true. They had at least returned back to the land and were able to begin rebuilding the temple and the city. Now we're going to cheat again, and we're going to jump out of the British Museum for these next two exhibits. Here we go. This is a marble bust of Antiochus IV, king of the Seleucid dynasty of Syria. And it's actually housed in Berlin. And next to it, you can see a coin of Antiochus IV as well. Antiochus came to power in 175 BC, so this is a couple of hundred years after Cyrus, king of Persia. And the time in between continued to be marked by the rising and falling of empires. The Persian Empire eventually gave way to the extraordinary military pursuits of the Greeks under Alexander the Great, until upon his sudden death in 323 BC, his empire imploded and was squabbled over by his four generals. And then eventually the Seleucid dynasty would rise to the top. Now, during all this time, Israel essentially swapped hands between the different empires. When the Jews returned back to their land, they remained under Persian control, as I mentioned earlier. And so the Greeks and then the Seleucids just inherited that. They inherited control of the Jews when they took over the Persian Empire. And tensions were building. Ever since they got back home to rebuild, hopes had been high. But empires had come and empires had gone, and God seemed to have done little more to move things along. The prophet Isaiah's visions of the future had been spectacular. His visions that had begun with the decree by Cyrus to send the Jews back to their land again had ended with wonderful pictures of a great and joyful future. Behold, I create Jerusalem to be a joy and her people to be a gladness, said the penultimate chapter of Isaiah's prophecy. And in the same passage, God had reiterated his promise that this was all part of his plan to make the whole world new. He hadn't given up on it. But not even the most glass-half-full Jew could claim that their situation in any way reflected those prophecies. Furthermore, while Cyrus had essentially left them to their own devices and even given them financial support to rebuild their temple, Antiochus IV was much more hands-on. He was a cruel and forceful ruler, and his style of empire was particularly offensive to the Jews. Basically, he saw himself as a much more god-like character. Never mind king of the universe. What about being God himself? And he felt that it was his job to tell them how they should be living. He even added the title Epiphanes to his name, which means God made manifest. That's what the text on these coins says. Antiochus Epiphanes, God made manifest. Antiochus realized, by the way, that coins were a good way of propagating such a message because everybody carried them around. You only had to look in your pocket to be reminded that you were being ruled over not just by the king of the universe, but by God himself. And Antiochus made it his job to impose Hellenistic culture, Greek culture, upon the Jewish society. No doubt he saw himself as some sort of saviour figure, rescuing the Jews from all their backward beliefs, bringing them out of the Bronze Age and into the modern age, teaching them to be more progressive. But Hellenistic philosophy and the morals that went with it were very offensive to the Jews. Remember, they believed that God himself had given them his commands, the very words of God, the real God. Yes, they had failed to live up to those in the past, but now all the more was the time to stick with what God had given them. So things were getting tense, especially as Greek culture was having no little influence on the Jewish youth of the day. And the final nail in the coffin was when Antiochus Epiphanes tried to claim that the Jews and the Greeks basically worship the same God. All religions are the same. We're worshipping the same God really in our different ways. That was his basic idea. And of course, what that looked like in practice was the Jews conforming to Greek culture. And so what Antiochus did was he ransacked the Jewish temple and he erected an altar to Zeus in the middle. No doubt all in the name of diversity. And to top it off, he sacrificed a pig on the altar and he forced the Jews to eat it. You need to understand that the Jews considered pork to be off limits, and so this was a very deliberate attempt to get them to conform to Greek culture and leave their own views behind. Some of the Jews gave in, others resisted and were slaughtered for it, or forced to flee the city, because that's what happens if you oppose God made manifest. And the Jews saw this as a terrible, terrible sacrilege that had defiled God's temple. This event became known as the abomination of desolation, which Jesus himself refers to at one point in the gospel narratives. So it was a confusing time. Many wondered what was going on. Wasn't the plan supposed to be that God was going to come and sort things out? Now that they were back in the land, wasn't he supposed to save them from their enemies and establish a glorious new age? This seemed like a radical step backwards, having returned to the land. Rebuilding the temple that had been destroyed had been seen as a key step of progress, but now it had been defiled by a pagan king. And there were some who felt that perhaps the time had come to take matters into their own hands. Maybe God was actually waiting for them to do that. Maybe this abomination was supposed to fill them with a military zeal for the righteousness of God. And a young man named Judas Maccabeus, nicknamed the Hammer, was just the man for the job. In 167 BC, he began a guerrilla war against the Seleucid government. He forced control of Jerusalem for a brief period of time. This was a real triumph, as it meant that a great ritual cleansing of the temple could be performed. And it gave rise to the feast of dedication called Hanukkah, that Orthodox Jews still celebrate today. But it was also quite clear that this was still a long way from establishing the new age that Isaiah and the other prophets had predicted. The temple had had a clean-up job, but where was God? And furthermore, the victory that Judas won was very short-lived. In 161 BC, he and his followers were eventually overcome by the Seleucid army, and Israel became manned by strong garrisons once again. Isaiah had said that Jerusalem would be like a bright light blazing brightly, and the kings and the nations would come and bring their wealth towards it. They would bring gold and frankincense and praises to the Lord God Almighty. That all comes from Isaiah chapter 60. But only those filled with religious delusion would believe that that was what was going on. In spite of all that Judas Maccabeus had done, kings were coming to Jerusalem all right, but they weren't bringing gold and frankincense. And so the tectonic plate that was ancient Judaism continued to build up tension as it rubbed against its neighbours. Okay, well, back to the British Museum again. We're jumping sort of round the floor that we're on the British Museum further around, but it takes a long time to walk round, so I'm just jumping straight to it. Now, in this glass case here, we are supposed to have a bronze bust of Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, but it's as you sometimes discover, even for the photographs that they've taken for this digital version of the British Museum, sometimes these exhibits go out on loan to other museums. So we're going to have to jump back to the still image to have a look at this. Here we go. That's what should be in the glass case there, along with another coin minted by Caesar Augustus. So now we're getting into New Testament territory, and we've also jumped forward in time about 100 years or so. The dominance of the Seleucid Empire was finally ended in 65 BC. The new kid on the block, the Roman army, came marching into the west, into Western Asia, and defeated them all. And so yet again, Israel was put under new management. Now the Romans, under Caesar Augustus, were a bit more hands-off than the Seleucids were, and willing to let the Jews manage their own affairs by and large. When Julius Caesar came to power just before Augustus in 49 BC, he gave the Jews exemption from the public worship of Roman gods, basically because it was less hassle that way, because they were so resistant. But there was still a fairly tight control put in place, especially in Israel itself. Two notorious characters that feature in the New Testament were evidence of this. One was King Herod, whom the Romans put in charge as a sort of puppet king, and the other was Pontius Pilate, who was put there as a governor of the region, basically a babysitter to make sure that Herod and the others were all behaving themselves. It was not an easy alliance, as I'm sure you can imagine. We'll come back to them both later. But for now, we turn our attention to Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus was the first emperor of Rome. He began to rule in 27 BC and ruled until 4 AD. So he was the emperor when Jesus was born. And his birth name was actually Gaius Octavius, but he took the title Caesar from his adopted father Julius Caesar. And then he allowed the Senate to give him the title Augustus, meaning August one, or the illustrious one. And an upgrade in name wasn't the only upgrade he gave himself as the first emperor of Rome. He established a noble Roman tradition of declaring that the previous ruler, in this case Julius Caesar, was actually some kind of god incarnate. And so, although he insisted on calling himself the first citizen of Rome, he was also sort of able to claim that he was the son of a god. And guess what? He used coins as a way of propagating that idea. So here we have an example of a Roman coin minted during the time of Augustus as emperor. And on one side, you have the head of Augustus. On the reverse, the words Divine Julius in Latin with a sort of cool sunburst motif behind it. Put them together, you get the idea that Augustus is the son of a god. Now, just as a brief aside, this is probably ringing some bells. It's a new spin on a very old game. Emperors and kings have liked to claim that they were in some way divine for as long as time itself, as you've seen already in the tour. And if you go downstairs in the British Museum, you'll find the huge statue of Ramses II, Pharaoh of Egypt, in the Egypt section. And you'll find exactly the same picture there as well. He built that statue as a part of a memorial complex so that he could be venerated as a god after his death. And we've seen Antiochus IV, who gave himself the title of Epiphanes, Cyrus, who called himself king of the universe, which is sort of getting close. And now here's Augustus up to the same kind of game, although it had to be downplayed a bit to please the Roman Senate. And you may have thought such things died out centuries ago, but I recently learned the North Korean media hailed Kim Jong-un as the Great One born of heaven. And you can bet that certain other world leaders would love to be deified in some kind of way if they thought they could get away with it. I'll leave that to your imaginations. Kings and emperors for centuries have been calling themselves the Son of God or God in some kind of form, and they all wind up in glass cases in the British Museum. There's a proverb in there somewhere, I'm sure. But anyway, I digress. Back to Augustus again. What did the Jews make of their new management? Well, Roman rule was less imposing than Seleucid rule, or at least to begin with, but God's plan for them still didn't seem to have progressed at all. And so different Jews had different opinions on what ought to be done. One group that features frequently in the New Testament were the Pharisees. They had a lot of influence, and they thought that Israel needed to stay true to its original calling. Many of us will have grown up going to Sunday school and believing that all Pharisees were sort of like pantomime baddies when we read through the gospel stories, but really they were like the Bible people of their time. The New Testament scholar Craig Blomberg observes that they were actually like the conservative evangelical pastors of their day. They cared about upholding what the Bible said. This is why they had such a dislike of people such as tax collectors, because tax collectors were invariably in cahoots with the Romans. As far as the Pharisees were concerned, if God's new age was going to dawn, it would only happen if everybody took the Bible more seriously. Maybe if all Israel stopped dabbling with the Romans like the tax collectors did and actually read their Bibles, God would come back again. Just as an aside, part of the reason why Jesus' conflict with the Pharisees in the gospel narratives is so interesting is that in theory they should have been on the same page. They both claimed to believe that God's will was the top priority, but in practice that looks very different. Another group that were prevalent in Judea around this time was the radical zealots, a nationalist terrorist movement known as the Dagger Men. And they were much more of the opinion that Judas Maccabeus was along the right lines. For them, the kingdom of God was only going to come about if everybody tooled up. Look to the recent past. When was Israel closest to establishing a new kingdom? Was it not when Judas Maccabeus managed to wrench Jerusalem out of Seleucid control? Or maybe he had the right idea, even if his efforts hadn't lasted. Maybe the way forward to the new kingdom was by the sword, even if there would be a few martyrs along the way. Now, before we go any further, I just want to take a little bit more time helping you to imagine what world was like in the Roman Empire and why the Jewish tectonic plate was rubbing up against the Roman one more and more threateningly. And for this, I want to look at what is by far and away the most controversial item on the itinerary. So if you've just started nodding off, this will definitely wake you up again. Let's jump back into the museum. And we're just going to navigate a couple of paces further forward in this room and turn and have a look at this silver cup in this glass case here. Now again, because the resolution is not so great, I'm going to show you another still image. So this is a small silver cup that was discovered near Jerusalem, but clearly comes from an owner who was part of the Greco-Roman world around the time of Augustus. And as you can probably see, the cup depicts a scene with two men who are quite clearly in a homosexual embrace. This was a scandalous object when it was first discovered, and it wasn't displayed in the British Museum for much of the 20th century. But it does give a clear snapshot of what Greco-Roman life was like. They were a culture of great sexual freedom, and they weren't embarrassed to celebrate it. They even made explicit cups such as this one to show off to the world. Our culture would probably have viewed the Romans as very progressive in some of their attitudes to sex had we been there. They were loud and proud about homosexuality long before gay pride was ever a thing. Although very interestingly, in other ways, Greco-Roman attitudes seem quite repugnant to us. For example, Demosthenes the Greek famously said that mistresses were kept for pleasure, concubines for the housework, and wives for bearing children. It's very striking to consider how Greco-Roman attitudes line up very well with some of the values of the 21st century West, and really don't in others. Now, in case you're feeling tense, rest assured that I'm not going to be making any kind of value judgment about the Romans' attitude to homosexuality, mistresses, concubines, or the rest. There may be plenty of us tuning into this who have very different views, and that's no problem at all for the sake of this tour. But what we need to understand is that for the first century Jews, this was a problem. It was this sort of sexual freedom, along with all the other morals of the Roman Empire, that were all very offensive to them. I think it's quite striking that this cup was found near Jerusalem. You can imagine the Jews, who already had a strong sense that this was their land, deeply resenting the way that Roman culture was being flaunted about in front of them, especially on strongly felt moral issues such as this. It's not quite as in your face as Antiochus Epiphanes was yet, but it's not far off. When we read about the Pharisees in the Gospels, we see that there were two groups that they felt exemplified everything that was wrong with Israel. The tax collectors, as already mentioned, and the sinners, which invariably meant the sexually promiscuous, both heterosexual and homosexual. Now, to reiterate again, I'm not saying that they were right or wrong in that attitude. All I'm saying is that this was the sort of thing that stoked the fire. The tectonic plates were beginning to crash together again, and the temperature was getting hot. All of this building towards the war of AD 66 to 70. But before we get to the war, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Herod the Great and his descendants. As I mentioned earlier, Herod had been put in charge by the Romans as a sort of figurehead Jewish king. He was expected basically to comply with the wishes of the emperor, and he was king when Jesus was born. Now, if we go back again to our room in the British Museum where we were in, so if you navigate further through this room, you get to a glass case just round here, which contains a load of coins, which is what we want to look at. But because it's the interface is quite difficult, I've just set up a view already. So here we can see a selection of coins, amongst other things in this case, which you can have a look at in more detail. But because the resolution is low, actually what we're going to do is look at a still shot anyway. Here we go. Here we have a rather scruffy coin from that case that I just showed you that was minted by Herod the Great, and you can just about make out the image of a soldier's helmet on it. Now, there's something about that image that tells you about what kind of man Herod was. The reason it's a helmet as opposed to, say, the head of a person, as you would normally have on a coin, was so as not to violate sensitivities over one of the 10 Commandments about making images of people. And yet Herod was a ruthless man, quite prepared to violate the other commandments, such as thou shalt not murder, for example. He was all about external show and virtue signalling, thinly disguising the fact that he was actually a murderous megalomaniac. Augustus once commented that it was better to be Herod's pig than his son. It's a play on words because the Greek for son and pig sound quite similar, but it's also a very dark joke about how Herod refused to eat pork because he was a Jew, so he wouldn't kill any pigs or go near any pork. But he was willing to have his firstborn son, his second wife, her 2 sons, and his mother-in-law all quietly murdered. Now, the report that Augustus gives of Herod fits exactly with what we find in the New Testament as well. First time we meet Herod in the New Testament is in Matthew's Gospel, in one of the famous Christmas passages, where he reacts violently to the news from the visiting Magi that a supposed new king had been born in Judea. And rather than going to investigate, he orders a horrific act of infanticide for all of the children of 2 or under in Bethlehem. The pigs were safe, but sadly not the baby children. Josephus, the Jewish historian, similarly records that Herod was a man of great barbarity towards all men equally, and a slave to his passion. And he was hated for several reasons. One was his cruelty, of course, but another was his obvious allegiance to Rome and not so subtle love of Hellenistic life, despite an outward veneer of Judaism. But the most obvious reason why he was despised was he simply wasn't the real king. In the Old Testament, it was as clear as day that the kings of Israel were supposed to come from David's line. And the prophets said that one of them would be the Messiah to liberate Israel and lead them into the new age. And Herod was clearly not that king. This is why when you read through the Gospels, people sometimes ask whether Jesus is David's son or not. They're trying to work out whether Jesus was the true king in David's line or just another posturer like Herod. But there was one thing that Herod did do that the people really approved of. As well as being a tyrant, he was a highly dedicated builder. And the most important building project he embarked on was the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, the temple was not just any old religious building. The Jews believed that from Solomon's time onwards, in the middle of the Old Testament, the Lord God had actually taken up residence in the temple. Its purpose was to be his house in the midst of the people. And he had actually literally brought his very own presence to reside there in some kind of way. And as the prophet Ezekiel recorded, when the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, that also represented God symbolically leaving his temple. In other words, he packed up his bags when the exile happened. But he had also promised that he would return again when he forgave their sins. So the new era that the Jews were looking forward to would be characterized by two key events. One was that God would raise up a new king from David's line, as discussed already, and the other is that he would rescue people from whichever empire was and that the king would rescue people from whichever empire was currently in charge. And the other was that the Lord God himself would actually return back to his temple and reside there once more. Now, when the Jews came back to Jerusalem in the time of Cyrus, they were forced to rebuild the temple, and it was in a way that was clearly inferior to the first one, because they just didn't have any money to make it as good as the first one was. It was a big disappointment, especially given that they were waiting for God to come back to it. It's a little bit like the experience that some of any married men amongst you may have. If your wife goes away for the weekend, let's say, and you want to buy her a bunch of flowers from the supermarket, you go to the supermarket and all they've got is the rather dry, dead-looking bunches of flowers. You have to kind of put one of those in a vase. That's a little bit like how the Second Temple felt to the Jews. It wasn't exactly a great homecoming house to the Lord God when he did decide to come back again. But it was the best that they could do with the money that they had. That is, until Herod the Great came along, and he embarked on a huge building project to make the temple far bigger and even more glorious than the first one had been. In fact, we have a picture of here's a model of the temple that Herod rebuilt. Now, for those of you who have read through Mark's Gospel, this is why the disciples remark how beautiful the temple looks when you get to chapter 13. It's because Herod spent a lot of money tripping it out. Now, in reality, Herod was probably building this as a monument to himself rather than to the glory of the Lord God. But it was a smart political move. It was certainly a way to fuel optimism that the Lord God might really come back to his temple fully and finally, make the temple great again, and maybe God will be persuaded to come back. By the way, I think this also betrays a rather shallow understanding of the prophets in the Old Testament, because God quite clearly hints that he doesn't need the temple to be beautiful for him to return again. He's perfectly capable of doing that himself, making it glorious himself. But then Herod probably only cared about whatever made him look great rather than whatever made God look great. Herod died in 4 BC, just shortly after Jesus' birth, and his area of influence was divided between his three sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip. By the way, it's it's funny how some Jewish names seem extremely kind of foreign to us, and others very familiar, isn't it? Herod's sons were Archelaus, Antipas, and Phil. Phil Herod sounds like he should be a plumber from East London or something like that, doesn't he? Rather than Jewish. Anyway, we won't take their time to tell their stories, but if you're reading through the Gospels, it's worth knowing that there are actually 5 different Herods mentioned in the Gospels, the ones I've just mentioned, and also Herod Agrippa, who appears later. Now, before we move on, I want to give a brief shout out to Pontius Pilate as well. Pilate, if you remember, had been made governor of Judea to keep an eye on things, which was not a great job if you were aspiring to rise in the ranks of Roman officials. You know, it's a bit like being made minister of sport or something like that. You know, not one of the more glamorous roles. And I think you get a sense that Pilate is resentful of his lot when you read about him in the Gospels. He's quite a sour character, and he didn't do much in his time as governor of Judea to help things. He did a lot of things that provoked the Jews, and eventually was hauled back to Rome to give an account of his mismanagement of the region. Here is an inscription that comes from Israel, mentioning that on a stone, mentioning that Herod was prefect of Judah at the time. Now, before we look at the next exhibits, I just want to take stock of the story so far and summarize for you, because we're about to get to the Jewish war, so it would be good to be clear on where things have got to. Oops, sorry. I began likening the historical context for the New Testament as being a bit like the colliding together of two tectonic plates. The huge, powerful world of the dominant superpower of the time, who, in the time of the New Testament, the Greco-Roman Empire, and the smaller but very agitated world of the ancient Jews. The Jews believed that they were living through a long, unfinished story. It began wonderfully back in Egypt several centuries earlier. They believed that the one true God of heaven and earth had chosen them to be his people. He had triumphed over Pharaoh. He had rescued them from their slavery. He had brought them to the land of Israel. And the story also had a clear and wonderful end goal to it. They believed that their God was a God who was committed to putting all things right. The world was not all that it was supposed to be. God had a plan to sort the whole world out and make it new and rescue the whole world in the same way that he had rescued Israel in the beginning. And Israel were to be the ones through whom he would work out that plan. But the story had got stuck in the middle. Their forefathers had made a huge mistake and abandoned God, and he had sent them off into exile. And they were waiting for him to forgive them and give them a fresh new start. They were waiting for him to establish a new kingdom and to put his plan for the whole world back on track. But the waiting game had gone on a long, long time. They had been allowed to return to their land under the decree of Cyrus the Great, if you remember. They had survived through the dark times of Antiochus Epiphanes, who had defiled the temple. They had enjoyed a short-lived independence thanks to Judas Maccabees. But they were now under Roman rule and getting more and more fed up. They had a puppet king, Herod, who everyone hated. They had a governor, Pilate, that everyone hated. They had Greco-Roman life forced upon them. And finally, the temple was being rebuilt into the glorious edifice that everyone felt that it really should be. So now surely was the time. Now surely was the time for Israel to be liberated. Now surely it was time for God to come back. Now surely it was time for God to truly forgive the sins of the past once and for all and give them a fresh new start. Surely it was time for the Messiah to come and save his people and for the kingdom of heaven to be established fully and finally in all the wonderful, glorious pictures that the prophet Isaiah and the other prophets had given. And it all went horribly wrong. Now, in order to unpack what happened with the Jewish war of AD 66 to 70, I want to show you a couple more coins. And again, these are housed in the same case in the British Museum that I showed you earlier in this case. But because of the resolution, we're also going to look at them a little bit more close up. Here we go. The top coin captures all the building tension of the Jewish world in just a couple of simple gestures. This was a silver shekel, stamped as a piece of political propaganda. Remember, coins were a good way to spread a message. On the one face is a cup representing the Omer cup that was used for offering God the first fruits. On the other cup is a tree in blossom. And you might think that these are random symbols, but they're not. They're symbols of a holy offering to God centered on the temple. And the text around the edge of the coin reads, Shekel Israel Year 1, referring to the first year of the revolt in 66 AD. And on the other side, it says, Jerusalem is holy. So the subtext here is make Jerusalem a holy offering, or if you like, make Jerusalem great again. It's a not very subtle rallying cry to support the rebellion that was just beginning, but couched in language of giving yourself as a holy offering to God. Several coins were produced like this during the Jewish revolt. So, we even have some coins that had this sort of propaganda stamped over the top of a Roman coin, where you can still see the outline of the head of the emperor. And again, it's not very difficult to work out the message being conveyed. Now, underneath that first coin, we have a second coin with a very similar message that comes from a little bit later on. This time the text reads, "Redemption for Judah." It's a very carefully chosen word, redemption, because it's the word used to free slaves in the slave market. And for the Jews, of course, it takes their minds all the way back to Egypt when God redeemed them from the clutches of Pharaoh. That is, he set the Hebrew slaves free. So essentially, the message is it's time for Israel to have another exodus. It's time to be set free from what is effectively slavery under the Roman Empire. Now, by contrast, here is a coin minted by the Romans just after AD 70, when the disaster that was the Jewish war finally happened, and it's giving a very different message. Here we see two figures next to a palm tree. The one on the left is a triumphant Roman soldier, and the one on the right, a Jewish woman with her head in her hand. And the text simply says, Judea captured. And the message of this coin is not hard to decipher either. Rome wins, as usual, and just to rub the Jews' noses in it, they made these commemorative coins. Now, when you went to the market and reached into your pocket, you'd be reminded of exactly who the winners and the losers really were. As if the crucified bodies outside the city gates wasn't reminder enough. Judea captured. Rome wins. Rome always wins. So what happened then? Well, as we've seen, the tectonic plates were rubbing together strongly in the time when Jesus was alive, around AD 30. What eventually led to the Jewish War of AD 70 was really a combination of different factors. Augustus Caesar's descendants rather liked the tradition he had introduced of deifying the previous emperor so that you could call yourself the son of a god. Thus began the cult of the emperor, as citizens were expected to acknowledge the divine work at power in their ruler. The third emperor, Caligula, took it all a step further and started deifying himself as the present emperor as well, expecting to be acknowledged as a god in public. In 41 AD, he tried to erect a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem, which possibly might have precipitated the war even sooner had he not suddenly died and therefore was not able to carry it out. The next emperor but one, Nero, revoked rights for Jews in Caesarea, which led to outcry. In response, the procurator Florus raided the temple treasury. By 66 AD, when the first coin that we looked at was minted, there was already fighting in the streets. For the zealots, the dagger men, as I mentioned earlier, the volcano was now erupting. They took it upon themselves to take out a small Roman garrison. Then they managed to defeat a whole legion sent to quell the rebellion. And that was enough to provoke the Roman juggernaut into action. Emperor Nero, enraged by the news of what had happened, sent his experienced general Vespasian with 3 legions this time, and instructions not just to settle the rebellion and sort it out, but actually to lay siege to Jerusalem itself and flatten it. All havoc broke out within the capital city, with the zealots turning on the moderate Jews for not joining in the fight against the Romans. They intentionally burned the stockpile of food to force the hand of the moderates into fighting against the Romans. But what it resulted in was a terrible famine. On the outside of the city walls, the Romans waited their opportunity while savagery, disease, and famine did all the work on the inside. And then finally in AD 70, the wall was breached and the Romans marched in. They ransacked the city and they burned it to the ground. With a doomed sense of inevitability, the zealots protected the temple, but eventually they were forced to surrender, and Herod's beautiful white edifice was reduced to rubble. The valuable goods of the city, including all of the temple items, were later paraded through the streets of Rome and used to finance the building of the Colosseum. This event was later commemorated with the building of the Arch of Titus, who took over from Vespasian for the battle against Jerusalem. And the Arch of Titus still stands in Rome today. You can go and see it for yourself. But here is a close-up of part of the Arch of Titus. And as you can see, there are the Romans depicted carrying the menorah, the golden candlestick from the temple in Jerusalem, and parading it through the streets. The candlestick was supposed to symbolize that Israel was the light for the nations, but instead it had just become spoil for the nations and used to pay for their sports stadium. The volcano between the tectonic plates mostly subsided after that. The final eruption was a rebellion some 50 years later, led by a ruthless man named Simon Bar Kokhba. In one last effort, Rabbi Akiva had proclaimed him to be the Messiah that they were waiting for, the son of the star. But it all got squashed pretty quickly, and Rome added another mark to its tally. And from that point onwards, the ancient Jewish tectonic plate essentially lay dormant. All the Jews were evicted from Jerusalem and forbidden to enter on pain of death, except for one day in the year when they were all allowed to come to one of the remaining walls of Herod's temple, now called the Western Wall. And 600 years later, a Muslim shrine would be built on the site that the temple once stood on, and that in turn would of course lead to the strife and conflict in Jerusalem that endures sadly to the present day, with the city divided into different quarters and all the difficulty that there is there. Obviously it's more complicated than that, but you get the idea. Now, to better appreciate this, I thought we'd make the most of the technology and actually go to Temple Mount with the help of Google Maps. So here we are in Jerusalem on top of the Temple Mount. This is the great plateau that Herod the Great built, and the temple would have originally been built on. My understanding is that the walls of the outer court would have run around the edge, all the way around the edge here. And the sanctuary, the big temple-like bit, would have been in the middle where the Dome of the Rock currently is. Those outer walls raised up on the edge of the plateau gave it protection from the Romans coming in, and that's why the Zealots were able to use it as a stronghold. But eventually they broke through and leveled the whole thing down to just the plateau. So let's just have a quick look around so you can see what it looks like today. And so basically nothing remains from the original temple except this plateau which it was built upon. Now, if we jump to this following view by the Western Wall, here's the plateau up on top, and here's the wall, which is one of the few remaining parts of what Herod the Great built. We can actually see in this picture, you can see Orthodox Jews gathered around the wall to pray. This was where they were allowed to come after having been banished from Jerusalem following the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and this is the way that it has been ever since. And so the big question is, well, what happened to all the Jewish hopes of a new age? They all seem to be dashed when the Roman army came and crushed the Second Temple. The Jewish expectation which was that the Lord God would one day return to his temple and begin a new era, was completely crushed. That he would send a Messiah to liberate them. It just didn't seem to have happened. And so to this very day, Orthodox Jews still gather at the Western Wall to pray and ask God that he would still do what he said, which is what you can see going on in this very photograph here. So then, where does the New Testament actually fit in all of this? All I've done so far really is to run you through the history of what happened to the Jews between about 500 BC under Cyrus the Great and 130 AD with the Bar Kokhba rebellion. In particular, the way their expectations for a glorious new age after their exile came into harsh conflict with the superpowers of their time, which led to the Jewish war and the destruction of the Second Temple. That's the history of what happened. But where does the New Testament actually fit within that historical backdrop? Because you'll have noticed that we sort of moved past the period that the New Testament covers, which was from about 30 to 60 AD or so. We essentially jumped from Herod the Great, who was king when Jesus was born, to the fall of Jerusalem. Now, in order to answer that, we're going to be, which we're going to do with the remaining 10 minutes of our time or so, we're going to go back to the British Museum and have another look we're going to go back to the British Museum again and have a look at a piece of a column from the Temple of Artemis in modern-day Turkey in Ephesus. Here we go. This is a column piece from the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey, which was a significant outpost of the Greco-Roman world and home to the great temple which this column piece comes from. So we're in the Greco-Roman tectonic plate at the moment, if you like, rather than the Jewish one. And this temple of Artemis was one of the great ancient wonders of the world. It's a little hard to get a sense of the scale if you're not here in person, but let me see if I can move around it. So it takes about 3 people linking hands to stand around this column piece. That's how big the circumference of it is, the diameter. So you can probably imagine just how vast the whole temple must have been just from extrapolating from that. And it absolutely dominated the city. Visitors would come from afar to see the temple and to pay homage to the goddess Artemis. This was no mere tourist attraction. Religion and day-to-day life were very integrated in the Greco-Roman world. So there was a huge commercial aspect to the life of the temple in Ephesus as well, as many came to buy her favour. If you were to walk here in the 1st century, you would have seen many silver statuettes of Artemis being sold amongst the various market stalls and other such religious trinkets. Now, an extraordinary thing took place in the mid-1st century in Ephesus, while tensions were brewing in Jerusalem, which is that a riot almost broke out among the silversmiths who supplied these stalls that sold statuettes of Artemis. And the reason for this was why they were enraged was because a Jewish man named Paul from Tarsus had managed to persuade so many non-Jews in the region to stop worshipping Artemis that their trade had begun to dry up. Now, this was quite surprising, as the Jews living in the non-Jewish world, such as in places like Ephesus, mostly kept themselves to themselves. They were waiting for God to liberate Israel before he came and did anything much in places like Ephesus. But Paul was different. He was preaching a slightly different message. And it was beginning to have a profound impact on the Greco-Roman world, such that even the silversmiths had begun to see a dip in their trade, and they weren't happy. But the really extraordinary thing was the content of Paul's message. And this is the key. This is where the New Testament all clicks into the historical backdrop that I've been describing so far. Paul's message was that the new age that the Jews were all waiting for had already begun, right under their very noses. God had already done it. There were many in Jerusalem busy tooling up, sharpening their swords, ready to fight and establish a new kingdom that would eventually lead to the Jewish war 15 years or so later. But Paul's message was that God had already established a new kingdom 20 years earlier. There were many in Jerusalem wondering if God would ever forgive the sins of the past and give Israel a fresh new start. But Paul's message was that God had already done that 20 years earlier. There were many in Jerusalem praying that God would finally return to his temple again. But Paul's message was that God had already done that 20 years earlier. There were many in Jerusalem longing for the Messiah to appear, the king in David's line who would rescue them and rule them. But Paul's message was that God had already done that 20 years earlier. He had already done it, which sounds sort of ludicrous at face value, because, of course, it doesn't look like all these things have already happened. The dagger men wouldn't have been plotting their next move if they believed that God had already come and done what they were waiting for. If you were to go to Jerusalem, you would have seen no real change to the temple, no evidence that God had rocked up recently, no change to the fortunes of the people. Life was, if anything, getting worse, not better. No change to the presence of Roman soldiers everywhere. Rome still seemed to be very much in charge. So what on earth was the basis of Paul's message? And why was it having so much traction? And why amongst the non-Jews even more than the Jews? In summary, why was Paul's message, which didn't seem to be true and was about the fulfillment of expectations for the Jews, convincing non-Jews to stop worshipping the goddess Artemis and start worshipping the God of Israel? How does that work? And it wasn't like this was just a flash in the pan either. For example, the Roman historian Tacitus, writing several decades later, mentions that this message, the message that Paul was spreading, was like a disease that had broken out of Judea and suddenly found its way all across the Mediterranean, even to Rome, like a plague does. So how does it all make sense? Well, to answer that, we're going to go to our final exhibit and to the other great capital of the ancient world, Athens. And to this, we're going to have to go down these stairs next door to what is the second most controversial exhibit of the tour in the Parthenon Gallery, the Elgin Marbles. Now, again, this is one of the clunky things about that. You just, for some reason on Google Maps, you just can't get from here into this room. I don't know whether you have to sort of make some blood sacrifice to get through or something, but we're going to cheat and just go straight into the room. Here we go. This is what it's like on the inside. So here we are in the famous Parthenon Gallery. And all these sculptures come, of course, from the Acropolis in Athens. And I don't particularly want to focus on any one sculpture, but give the general effect of what the Parthenon must have been like, which is what the British Museum have tried to sort of recreate in some kind of way here. Athens was a place of great sophistication and learning. Not just because of the Parthenon, but also because of the Areopagus nearby, where the renowned schools of philosophy all met and debated. And as part of his journeys across the Mediterranean, Paul visited Athens shortly before he came to Ephesus, where he caused such a stir with the silver makers. Now, whereas in Ephesus Paul was seen as a threat, in Athens they were much more interested in what he had to say. In the book of Acts in the New Testament, we learn more about the conversation that Paul had with the philosophers at the Areopagus. And the heart of his message was this: that the Jewish Messiah had come, that he had been killed by crucifixion by his own people, but that God had made him the king of the whole world. And the way that God had done that was by raising him from the dead and giving him the highest seat of authority. And this was the key evidence upon which Paul hung absolutely everything. The emperors of Rome might have liked to appoint themselves as sons of God, or even gods themselves. Antiochus IV might have thought that he was God made manifest. Cyrus might have thought that he was king of the universe. But actually now, a real son of God has come along. That was Paul's message. And God has proved that by raising him from the dead and exalting him to heaven, to which Paul claimed he himself was an eyewitness, along with many others. Consider, for example, the opening words from Paul's famous letter to the Romans. He writes that the gospel of God was promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead. Jesus Christ, our Lord. And this is how, according to Paul, the whole Jewish story makes sense. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus were historical events that Paul and the other disciples claimed to have seen with their own eyes. But Paul also saw that they were full of theological meaning. The Jews were waiting for their sins to be forgiven. They were waiting for God to come back again. They were waiting for a new kingdom to begin that would triumph over all the nations, beginning a glorious new age. And Paul's answer was that that had already begun to happen in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. In him, the Spirit of the Lord God had come back again. In him, sins had been forgiven by his self-sacrificial death on their behalf. In him, the new kingdom had begun when he rose from the dead. These were all historical events that Paul claimed to have seen with his own eyes, and others too. But what they meant, according to Paul, was that a new era had begun. A genuine Son of God had been appointed as king of the whole world, although he had a very different sort of kingdom from Caesar Augustus or Tiberius or Nero or the rest. One of the astonishing features of the gospel narratives of Jesus' life in the New Testament is that Jesus predicted in advance that the temple was going to be destroyed in a great war in several places. In Mark chapter 13, for example, Jesus announces that the temple, which seems so wonderful, is all going to fall within a generation. But that it actually doesn't matter, because all of God's plans are being fulfilled in him instead. The kingdom is being launched several decades before Jerusalem all comes crashing down, but in a surprising and subversive way. And this is how the New Testament fits into the world of the first century history. The Jewish tectonic plate and the Roman tectonic plate that came crashing together and created the volcano that was the Jewish-Roman War of AD 70. But as the dust settled, the announcement that God's kingdom had already begun in the risen Jesus was like the shoots of green that appear and poke through on both sides of the tectonic plates. And so to finish with, I really want to just come back where we started with the graffiti about Alexamenos. It seems so ridiculous that a Roman man would be worshipped would be worshipping a crucified Jew a century or so after the Roman-Jewish war. But hopefully we can now see why. It was Paul and the other disciples' conviction that God had raised him from the dead that changed absolutely everything. And that meant that he was now the new king of the world. And it seems that the non-Jewish world was very ready to hear this. A new kind of empire that wasn't built upon tyranny, but upon forgiveness, a fresh start with God, unity with others, and ultimately, of course, the promise of resurrection from the dead for every follower. Thank you for listening. That's the end of the talk.